Muhammad Akram Nadwi offers an acutely observed portrait of the student intent on acquiring this knowledge. From an insider's vantage point, he takes us into a world most of us normally do not enter. And they help us to appreciate the rich intellectual heritage and the traditions and the lively debates that go on within Islamic educational institutions. The contribution of Madrasah Life is significant. It counters the assumptions today, especially in the West, that madrasas are inevitably anti-modern and marginal. Well, I cannot avoid referring to the larger implications of today. It's particularly fitting, I think, that we have the launch of this book on this day, 7/7, the anniversary of a tragic day in our history. That and the events of the past week in London and Glasgow have put the spotlight once again on Muslims and Islam. We all know that there's a long history here of interaction between Islam and the West. There were certainly moments of mutual knowledge. There were moments of mutual exchange that were constructive. But sadly, what has been remembered by and large are the Muslim expansion into Europe, ranging from the Arab conquests through the Crusades and the Ottoman Empire. And these memories, I am sorry to say, have produced alienation and distrust of Islam. Islam, in fact, became a double threat. It became a theological threat and a political threat. Islam became increasingly familiar, but not understood. In fact, one might say that Western commentators over the centuries, right up to our own time, have, as one scholar put it, luxuriated in our ignorance. This ignorance reflected the fact that it was, at first, exotic, but also the all-too-human common tendency among educated and uneducated alike to denigrate and to dehumanize the other, to assume a superior position, to dismiss that which challenges our own beliefs by labeling it inferior, heretical, fanatical, or irrational. Distorted depictions, caricatures of the Prophet Muhammad and Islam were created, actually more accurately, were fabricated with little concern for accuracy. And perhaps, as we've seen in Denmark and Europe recently, with the scurrilous cartoons, perhaps with an eye to selling magazines and newspapers. It's ironic to me at least, that although Western intellectuals and policymakers today call somewhat patronizingly for a reformation in Islam, it is at this high point of European civilization, the European Reformation, that we presented Islam in wholly negative and unnuanced ways. It became the symbol of the Antichrist. For Martin Luther, Muslims were not open to reason and thus could only be resisted by the sword. In later centuries, Islam continued to be used as a foil for authors who championed the Enlightenment principles and virtues. Voltaire, I think many of you will know, entitled his book on the Prophet Muhammad, Fanaticism, and portrayed him as a theocratic tyrant. And Ernest Renan famously dismissed Islam as incompatible with science and the Muslims as, quote unquote, listen to this, incapable of learning anything or of opening themselves to a new idea, unquote. This, despite the deep learning, the deep legal learning that emerged by the 3rd and 4th Islamic centuries, this, despite the glories of Islamic science and philosophy in the Abbasid period. This despite the flourishing of social and political thought in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Sadly, these stereotypes of a static, irrational, retrogressive, anti-modern Islamic tradition were perpetuated by modernization theorists in our own time. So we have all of this as a sort of historical memory. And in a way, what they have done is given us a number of generalizations, which perhaps are understandable as a way of making sense of a complex life, but we should call them what they are. They're patently simplistic, and they amount to profiling on a global scale. Now, British Muslims have naturally been unable to escape this climate of mutual suspicion. And I think there has been endless talk, and we hear it every day now, about the training of imams and what Muslims want. It's not for me to say what Muslims want, but I should think that the chance to be full citizens is chief among them. It seems to me that the Western political order has conventionally been predicated on several assumptions: freedom, equality, the rule of law. To my mind, Muslims in the West, in Britain, are not rejecting these principles. In fact, they're merely asking that they should be extended to them. I think much progress has been made, and we shouldn't lose sight of it. I am humbled by the fact that in this room there are people who are working every day in community relations, in organizations, in the prisons. There is a great deal of progress. We see this in the provision of halal food in the schools, the proliferation of mosques on the landscape, the development of Muslim schools, even the encouragement of Muslim social organizations. And if I may say so, Muslims themselves have an immense responsibility here in shaping the future, a responsibility to fellow Muslims, to the larger national society, and to Muslims abroad. To my mind, it's nothing less than this. They are, you are, the shapers of Muslim pluralism. And to the extent that you're successful, the implications for the Western Islamic encounter are momentous. So I think that we have a great deal of problems and responsibilities before us. Tolerance is what we needed, what was needed. Simply a minimal form of getting on, rubbing along together isn't enough. We need to figure out whether or not multiculturalism can survive in the future, and how minorities connect to the broader civic order is something which we need to think about. Social tolerance is a work in progress. This requires the work of the entire citizenry, but it also requires scholarship from both the government and the minority communities. So let me just conclude on this point. I've just said that leadership is important, and I think leadership comes in several forms. And perhaps the most enduring form of leadership, the most penetrating in the long run, is scholarship. Muhammad Akram Nadwi's sweet and elegant book may seem to take us away from the trials and tribulations of conflict and radicalism. But in showing us the depth, the serenity, and the beauty of Islamic learning, he reminds us of what is truly important: faith, knowledge, and piety. These must, not just can or should, these must guide the development of society. It is an insight not just for Muslims, but for all of us. A lesson not simply appropriate for school days, but wisdom for all our days. We are thus indebted to Turath Publishing and to Muhammad Akram Nadwi. To paraphrase Iqbal, God has given him a heart full of passion and thus enabled him to unravel, to untangle the knots of ignorance. I congratulate you and thank you.